Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Paul Halliday, and it's my delight to welcome you to this panel entitled Magna Carta in the Age of Enlightenment, Revolution, and Empire, Rethinking Constitutional History on the 800th Anniversary of Magna Carta. I'll be chairing today's session, and I will offer some brief comments at the end. And of course, as part of my duties, I want in particular to provide introductions for each of our speakers. I'll do that one at a time so that each of them can have their moment there rather than racing through them and then having them jump up here. I'll go through, we'll do the panel in the order in which it appears in your program. So I believe that means we'll be starting with Professor Colley, then Professor Holzbach, and then Professor Travers. Let me begin then with Linda Colley, who is now the Shelby M.C. Davis Professor of History at Princeton, having taught previously at Yale, LSE, and at Cambridge. She's the author literally of a half dozen books, most recently Acts of Union and Disunion, a thoughtful provocation for those thinking about whether or not the Scots made the right decision in recent months. I know that when I was a young graduate student, it was her first book, In Defiance of Oligarchy, that got me and lots of other people rethinking British politics at the most fundamental level in the 18th century. And then early as I got my career going, it was Britons that got us rethinking nationhood more broadly in the 18th century. More recently, she's the author of Captives in the Ordeal of Elizabeth Marsh, two books that I think do a terrific job of making us nervous, just as she reminds us the people of the 18th century were nervous about the realities of imperial experience. I have to admit, though, perhaps because of my own interests, one of the things on her CV and that I've seen of her work myself in the past is that she curated an exhibition at the British Library a few years ago called Taking Liberties, and I know that that was part of what she is up to these days. As she is working on a project that I believe she's currently calling Word Power, that addresses the global emergence and diffusion of written constitutions, which I think leads us very nicely then to the paper she's going to give us this afternoon, A Changing Magna Carta. Please welcome Linda Colley.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming to listen this afternoon. This brief paper focuses on imaginings of Magna Carta. In 1848, an English jurist, historian, and future colonial law officer, Edward Shepherd Creasy, drew attention to its significant paradox, or at least a paradox as he saw it. Magna Carta, he wrote, was a document that was on everybody's lips, but in nobody's hands, and though perpetually talked of, is generally talked of in utter ignorance of its contents. At this time, the mid-19th century, official and iconographic references to Magna Carta in Britain were, as Michael Kamen remarked, more evident than celebrations of the federal constitution in the United States. Images of the barons who had confronted King John at Runnymede were, for instance, carefully included in the designs of the new Houses of Parliament at Westminster, built in the 1840s and 50s, the only non-royal figures to be so commemorated. Yet, as Creasy noted, Magna Carta was referenced far more widely than it was actually read, and understandings of its meanings and significance were extremely variable. This afternoon, I want briefly to address these paradoxes, focusing on 3 points. First, the importance of Magna Carta being a discrete text that lent itself exponentially to dissemination by print. Second, the multivalence of Magna Carta. its vital capacity to cater to very different groupings and agendas, and finally, the degree to which increasing and changing British celebration of Magna Carta after 1750 needs to be understood in part in the light of transnational developments. Now, it's usually Magna Carta's provisions that are focused on, its content, but no less significant as far as its changing impact is concerned was its nature as a material object, the fact that this was a text. As a relatively brief text, some 4,000 words, that's slightly shorter than the original federal constitution, Magna Carta was easily portable. It could be translated in due course into any written language, and as print culture began to expand in Britain, so too did Magna Carta's potential reach and audience. The fact that most of its provisions were highly specific and time-bound, more than half of its original clauses address 13th century fiscal issues, actually proved an advantage in this respect, which one might not have imagined. It meant that publishers, printers, and commentators, instead of having to reproduce and discuss the entirety of Magna Carta, could focus instead on select parts of it, especially on the so-called golden passage, clauses 39 and 40, which you probably know. No free man will be taken or imprisoned or outlawed or exiled or in any way ruined, nor shall we go or send against him, save by the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. To no one shall we sell, to no one shall we deny or delay right or justice. Some measure of the growing interest in and attention to Magna Carta from the 17th century onwards can be found in British newspapers. According to the British Library online index of these, about 30 brief articles appeared on Magna Carta in English newspapers in the first half of the 18th century, as well as many one-off references. As more press outlets emerge, and as newspapers increasingly spread to Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, Magna Carta received increasing coverage. In the second half of the 18th century, over 450 short articles seem to have been devoted to it. Between 1800 and 1849, this index reveals some 4,000 articles in the British press on Magna Carta. While in the second half of the 19th century, when newspapers exploded in number and became very much cheaper, over 13,500 articles were published in the UK mentioning Magna Carta. A similar exponential rise occurred with books, broadsides, magazines, and pamphlets. Scholarly attention has usually focused on the rediscovery of Magna Carta in the 17th century. But in terms of the history of book production and print, it is developments in the post-1700 period, especially post-1750, that are striking. Thus, the EBO search engine gives some 95 references to Magna Carta, Magna Charta as it was called, in books published in England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland between 1640 and 1700. Echo, however, lists over 4,000 references during the second half of the 18th century. Now, these are manifestly impressionistic figures only, and derive in part, of course, from a general rise in the volume of print culture in Britain after the 1690s. But Magna Carta's widening appeal and circulation also reflected the malleability of some of its language. When the original drafters of Magna Carta in 1215, whoever they were, because we don't know, referred in Latin in various clauses to free man or free men, they were manifestly not gesturing to anything approaching democracy. They used the term free men to distinguish the subjects of their benevolence from the majority of English men and women who were villeins, that is, unfree peasantry, people to whom Magna Carta in 1215 offered very little. But in subsequent centuries, and increasingly across the globe, Magna Carta's references to free men were interpreted in a wider, more democratic sense, as precious guarantees of liberty potentially to everyone. The fact that Magna Carta was a relatively brief document that left a lot of things out also made multiple interpretations much easier. You can see this in religion. At one level, Magna Carta is celebrated on both sides of the Atlantic, of course, as part of the Protestant inheritance. King John's Magna Carta being, as it were, the counterpart to King James's Bible. But on the other hand, the fact that it is Catholics who created Magna Carta in 1215 also means that this text is used, particularly from the later 18th century, by those wanting Catholic emancipation and by those wanting to attack Protestant prejudices about the reputed unfreedom of Rome. By the same token, there is enormous political flexibility in practice about Magna Carta. As is well known, the struggles between Crown and Parliament in the 17th century served dramatically to redirect attention to the text with great classic works like Cook's Institutes of the Laws of England, the second volume of which especially heaps honorifics on Magna Carta. And of course, Cook's Institutes go on to become one of the great foundation texts for the study of the common law. But in subsequent centuries too, whenever there were struggles over the organization and allocation of power in Britain, different partisan groupings usually had recourse to Magna Carta. Thus, in the 1760s, the London radical John Wilkes included an image of Magna Carta on the masthead of his newspaper, the Middlesex Journal or Chronicle of Liberty. Simultaneously, however, George III, the monarch whom John Wilkes sometimes ventured to attack, commissioned a portrait of himself, gesturing in a proprietorial manner towards Magna Carta, a pose that was adopted by many other patrician art patrons at this time, and indeed a pose adopted by subsequent British monarchs too. Now, again, it's partly the verbal malleability and enigmatic brevity of Magna Carta that allowed it to be so diversely preempted. In addition, those seeking support from Magna Carta could emphasize different aspects of the text to suit their particular political and ideological purposes. Among conventional patriots, Magna Carta's precocity and stress on the supremacy of the law could seem to offer yet more proof of national, sometimes English, sometimes British exceptionalism. For conservatives like George III, moreover, the early medieval origins of Magna Carta were useful as a demonstration that liberties in Britain had been a slow, gradual, and organic growth, and consequently that no sudden radical changes were necessary or wise. Radicals and revolutionaries on both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed elsewhere, however, often read the lessons of Magna Carta differently. After all, King John had not chosen of his own free will to agree to Magna Carta. He had been compelled to do so by force. Looked at this way, Magna Carta was an iconoclastic document, an act of resistance, an act of revolution even. Consequently, when Tom Paine published Common Sense in 1776, he was able to urge Americans to establish their freedom from Britain by writing a new Magna Carta. And it's easy to find later 19th and 20th century anti-colonial activists in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific world, also sometimes referencing Magna Carta as a banner of revolt and as a claim-making text. So much so that in 1947, a British official reputedly vetoed the suggestion of introducing a Magna Carta celebration day on the grounds that, quote, colonial peoples might be led into an uncritical enthusiasm for a document which they had not read, but which they presumed to contain guarantees of every so-called right. Many late 18th and early 19th century, and indeed early 20th century dissidents within Britain also sought at times to lay claim to Magna Carta, though not invariably so. Some, like the utilitarian philosopher and legal reformer Jeremy Bentham, argued that Magna Carta was simply too old a document and catered too much to national complacency to serve useful modern purposes. The cult of Magna Carta, suggested Bentham, could function as a camouflage for the harsh and inequitable realities of power. The aegis of liberty was held up to cover all, he suggested, and to dazzle the eyes of weak-sighted observers. Yet Bentham and those who argued like him, John Cartwright, for example, were actually wrong to suppose that modernity was bound to empty Magna Carta of significance. In some respects, international developments after 1750 allowed the document fresh traction and currency. An increasing resort to portentous political and legal single documents is often associated with the age of revolutions after 1776. Yet it was already becoming marked in the 1750s, if not a little before. Now, in part, of course, this is because of the Enlightenment, if you like, the notion of rational men revising government and law in a rational way and putting this down in a significant text. But I think the increasing turning towards single, iconic, and innovating text, you can also connect with the emergence of unprecedentedly large wars in the mid-18th century, and a consequent need to reconfigure and re-represent states and empires. And I should say this increasing resort to significant single document text is not just a characteristic of the West at this time, though it's certainly going on in the West, obviously. Thus, in 1751, Frederick the Great of Prussia, who had been very much caught up in the War of Austrian Succession, issued a new legal code, ordering its publication and translation into several languages. Catherine the Great of Russia sought to do something similar in 1767, issue a new legal code, partly out of Enlightenment sensibilities, partly in response to the disruptions of major war. There were some early new written constitutions emerging too in the 1750s and 60s, such as those drafted for Corsica by Pasquale Paoli in 1755 and by Rousseau a decade later. These are usually seen purely as Enlightenment texts. Again, you can see them partly as a response to war, in this case, the 7 Years' War. I don't think it's accidental that this same period, the 1750s and 1760s, the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, the War of Austrian Succession, with all the imperial and nationalistic repercussions of that, also sees more sustained and sophisticated and inventive attention being devoted to Magna Carta. In the late 1750s, for instance, an original copy of Magna Carta is put on display in the new British Museum with a sign saying, "The bulwark of our liberties." This more deliberate celebration and treatment of Magna Carta, evident from the mid-18th century, and there's lots of other examples I could cite, became, however, still more pronounced after the American Revolution. And I think, again, it is clear why. Between 1776 and 1780, as many of you will know, 11 one-time American colonies drafted single-document state constitutions. These had an impact on the US federal constitution, which in turn influenced subsequent written constitutions in France, Switzerland, Haiti, the Iberian and Italian peninsulas, and elsewhere. By 1820, some 50 written constitutions were in operation in continental Europe alone. 80 more constitutions were adopted between 1820 and 1850, many of them in Latin America. And by 1914, these texts, written constitutions, had spread to parts of Asia, Africa, and the Pacific world. Britain, however, remained conspicuously aloof from these modes of written constitutionalism. But very quickly, some of its political actors and commentators began to represent Magna Carta as a kind of prototype written constitution and or as a substitute for a written constitution as far as Britain was concerned. Thus, when the Genevan-born political theorist Jean-Louis Delorme published collections of the American state constitutions in London in 1782-3, he pointedly described them as the Magna Carta of the United American States. By the same token, if you look at the parliamentary debates from 1776 to 1800, you can see an upward surge in references by peers and MPs to Magna Carta, a response to the contagion of constitutions, as David Armitage describes it. But those seeking to argue that in Magna Carta Britain possessed a sort of pioneer written constitution that both ruled out any need for the real thing at home, while serving as a model abroad, faced certain obvious challenges. One of the under-acknowledged functions of successful written constitutions everywhere has always been to serve as a form of soft power. Thus, as we will hear, political actors in the US have persistently deployed and disseminated its constitution so as to spread American influence and values abroad. But while British domestic, diplomatic, and imperial officials could and did trumpet the virtues of Magna Carta, the original document was too old and too brief to serve by itself as an adequate means to communicate British political and legal values and systems overseas. And this, I'm sure, helps to account for the marked rise in constitutional history writing that takes place in 19th and early 20th century Britain. That very phrase, constitutional history, is first popularized in the 1820s by an Englishman, Henry Hallam. And I think we should see this huge outpouring of written constitutional history in Britain in the 19th and early 20th century, much of which is exported overseas as, in a sense, again, a response to the rash of written constitutions which Britain does not emulate as such. All this said, it remained the case that Magna Carta itself, as a historical text, continued to be widely unread, or was often consciously or unconsciously misread. By the early 20th century, most of Magna Carta's original provisions had been repealed by the Westminster Parliament, underlining the fact that this document was not a fundamental law. Nonetheless, in 1917, the Scottish jurist, liberal politician, and historian James Bryce, who certainly had read Magna Carta, still felt able to argue that it seemed not too fanciful to say that the prelates and barons of Runnymede, building better than they knew, laid the foundation of that plan of written or rigid constitutions which has now covered the world from Peru to China. It is, when you think about it, an extraordinary set of audacious arguments to claim, on the one hand, that because Britain has Magna Carta in part, it does not need itself a written constitution, but simultaneously to argue that the example of Magna Carta is an incentive to written constitutions everywhere else in the world. And it is an extraordinary polemic which you see developing over the Victorian age, and it reinforces the point I've been trying to make, the extreme plasticity of this iconic text. Thank you.